Not quite sure how to follow that video. That was leaves me very confused. And Enoch, by the way, you did promise to set the bar low, and I have to say you failed on that. So this is going to be a tough thing to follow. I'm here to talk about a subject today that I know that we're all very excited to talk about, which is this real estate crash and housing crash that we've been through about the last 5 years. Before I do that, though, I want to mention there are two interesting things going on today. One is it's National Bike to Work Day, and the other is that today is the Facebook IPO. So how many people know if they're related? How are they related? Oh, good. So hopefully by the end of this you'll have an idea. So what I want to convey is that sort of 3 points that I really hope to leave you with today. One is that this housing crash that we've been through is no ordinary housing crash. The second is that it's actually changing us in some very fundamental and very interesting and surprising ways. And the third thing is that this is actually a good thing. So this is the story that I hope to tell. So, we've all followed the news. We all have our ideas of who the particular villains are. There's no real need to rehash this. We all have our ideas, perhaps it's evil bankers or, corrupt politicians. The reality is, I think we know that for a lot of years, we've kind of all been playing with monopoly money. And whether it's us individually in our own lives, whether it's our government, whether it's our banking system, we've been very loose and easy with cash and credit in this country. And not just in this country, but in a lot of the world. And the result, or the reason that we are after this is because we've all sort of believed very strongly since childhood in this myth of the American dream. This idea of owning our own home on our own lot, and frankly, the bigger the home or the bigger lot, the better off we are. And that this is indicative of the good life. This is what it means to aspire to achieve in America. And so this belief that's just so deeply ingrained in our culture has really changed how our country has developed and behaved for some very fundamental ways over the course of, say, the last 70 years or so. One of those is that home ownership has become an institution in this country. And that's really historically a fairly new thing. You can see that we changed a lot of policies in the 1930s, especially creating FHA, creating Fannie Mae, which we did specifically to allow people more access to cash and credit so that they could buy and build homes. And that really changed us from a rental society to an ownership society. But it had a lot of other effects as well. One of those is that our cities became much more spread out geographically. So even places like Cleveland or St. Louis, which either declined or held steady in population, still expanded dramatically geographically. And because that's because we had to find room for all of these homes and the roads and everything else to sort of feed them. And that essentially led to a culture, a driving culture in this country that had another consequence, which is that we've become very susceptible and very knowledgeable about the whims of what happens with oil and gas. And in fact, if you think about it, gas is sort of the one commodity that we actually see the price of on a daily basis everywhere you go. Everything else we track occasionally, but gas we know intimately because it's so important to our lives. So any great story has a climax, has a struggle, and we certainly have it here with the housing boom and bust that we've experienced. Now, I could probably show you about 20 different charts that would explain what's going on with the boom and the bust. But I've just got a couple here. So these were the I thought were the most interesting. This one is actually looking at housing prices over the course of about the last 40 years. And you can see the dramatic run up that happened. You can also see, interestingly, what happens if you follow this line straight at sort of a normal inflationary rate. And you see that we're only now just about approaching where houses would be if things had sort of normally inflated, which is interesting to think about. The second thing is looking at housing prices over the long haul of time, over about 120 years or so, relative to other things in our lives that we track, population growth, building cost, even 10-year T-bills. And you can see the dramatic spike up that happened in the last decades of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And so this is all well and good, and it's very interesting that we can sort of talk about numbers and statistics. But the real question happens is, what does this mean on a personal level? How does this affect us personally? And so for me, I thought it would be more interesting to talk about how this has affected my own life, and how that I think that relates to some larger trends that are going on in American society. So this image is, this is actually a house that I built for myself in 2005. Great year, right? Good year to build a house. Right at the peak of the market. I'm an architect, and the 2000s for most of us as architects were actually pretty good years. We were all prospering and doing well. I owned a company with a good friend of mine. Business was good, and like many architects, we were prospering. About 2007, we really began to see a change. And the interesting thing about architecture is we're very tied to what's going on in real estate. So we're really on the front lines in terms of whether something good or bad is occurring. So in 2007, we saw a dip of about 10% in our business. In 2008, about another 10%. So at that point, we're down about 20%. And actually feeling kind of good compared to what's going on in the rest of our industry. In fact, by 2010, by all estimates, there were about 25 to 30% of architects that were unemployed. And that doesn't include the additional group of people who took pay cuts to stay in their jobs. So, but when we were in 2009, we were looking ahead, and we didn't see another dip, but we saw a cliff. And we were looking at 2010 being a year where business would drop 50% if we were lucky. And so we made the tough choice that an awful lot of people in my field had to do, and we decided to close our business and move on and find something else to do. So for me, that obviously leads to a lot of things where you have to sort of stop and really think about what's going on. What are your priorities? Where do you want to be? What do you want to do? How does this sort of change your outlook on life? One of the things that I did is I became one of those legions of millions of people who took my house and gave it back to the bank. Now that I no longer had the regular salary that I had before, I couldn't afford the mortgage. Made a very tough decision that was sort of against all of my principles, but to say, bank, you're gonna have to have it back. So this was really an interesting thing for all of us to sort of think about, what do you do next? For me, it led me to Savannah, Georgia. So why Savannah? Well, actually, I'll come back to that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But another thing that was very interesting is it really led me as a person to sort of reevaluate all of my notions and preconceived beliefs about housing. And what do I think about housing? How does it impact my life? How do I relate to it? What are my preferences? And I'm a renter now, and find actually that I enjoy being a renter. And this kind of puts me in line with what's going on in a lot more of society. Homeownership is down about 4% since the peak. I believe we'll continue to see that drop. It'll be interesting to see what impact the housing crash has on the legion of 18 to 29-year-olds who have sort of come of age during this crisis and their views of what is a good outcome for a home. For me personally, I know that I will never buy a home again as a financial vehicle. There may be reasons to own a home, but as a wealth-building mechanism, it doesn't work for me anymore. And I think you'll find that that is a sort of a common feature for a lot of people. There's some interesting other statistics to track in all of this. One is that I spend now about a third of what I did before on housing. So I actually have more disposable income to spend on things that I like. A study came out recently in California that really caught my eye that the Urban Land Institute put out, which is a very respected group of developers, and said that in the state of California, that if nobody built a new single-family house for the next 25 years, that there actually was demand to soak up what existed. Pretty remarkable changes going on. Another thing that happened for me was I came to Savannah and I found myself living in a place, the kind of a place that I have been professing for years is the kind of place that I think is an ideal or good place to live in, which is a place where you can park your car and leave it and just walk a lot. And so this is what happens to my car many, many days out of the week. So this is one of those things, how does that impact me? How does it impact my life? I am very much immune to what happens with gasoline prices these days. Whether it goes up or down a little matters very little to me. And that is sort of a correlation. The average home in America, the average household spends 18% of their budget on transportation. 18% is kind of a shocking number. Healthcare, which we hear about repeatedly with endless stories, the average household spends 6% on it. 3 times that amount we spend on transportation. In my profession, we have a statistic called VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled. VMT, we've been tracking since World War II, has been on a straight line up. It actually peaked in 2004, and Americans are driving less. It's down 6% since 2004. And it's especially led by the 18 to 29-year-old generation, who are now driving 23% less than they did 7 years ago. What are they doing? And instead, they're walking, they're biking, they're taking public transportation. In fact, even in households that are making $70,000 or more, public transit use is up 100%, biking is up 122%. Things like car sharing, Zipcar, which is the leading car sharing service, had 50,000 members 6 years ago, now has 630,000 members. This is a fundamental change that's going on in how we experience our communities. Another good thing that happens is I suddenly find with all of these combination of things, I find myself with an awful lot more leisure time, a lot more social time. And this is a good thing because we are social creatures. Even in the age of Facebook, we do need to connect. And we find ourselves actually wanting to connect more. And in fact, there are studies that show that you actually live longer and live better the more strong personal connections that you have in your life. So this is just something that I really saw that I enjoyed. I think this was in Troop Square, if I remember right. It's a funny thing, but I think it's indicative of sort of where we're headed, how things are changing. It's not live fast, die young necessarily anymore. So in order to wrap this up, there's a lot of things that occur to me as I think about what's going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years. I think people my age and older are going to be very surprised by how our communities change over the next decade or two. And I think we're going to find that it looks an awful lot like things did 70 or 80 years ago, but with a different and updated twist on it. We're going to connect more. We're going to look at our housing differently. We're going to get around our places very differently. And this is a good thing. Thank you.